right, so I think we're ready to start this second panel. I'm delighted to, I'm Aurélien Portuez, professor at George Washington University, and I'm delighted to be joined by Abigail Bishop, who is the head of external relations at Amazon, where she leads the company's global outreach to ensure the integrity of Amazon's customer experience. We have also Mike. Mike Burns is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at CTIA, where he leads the regulatory strategy and represents the organizations before federal and state policymakers. We have Fernando Lopez right here, who is the Senior Director at FICO and has a long and established history of also working in payments, financial crimes, analytics, and risks management. And finally, we have Nick Rossman, who heads the X-Product abuse team within Google Trust and Safety. His team is responsible for managing on-platform incidents, including those stemming from regional conflict and generative AI abuse. So it's going to be a fascinating panel of looking at how sometimes LLM developers and platforms can actively fight AI scams. And that's very important too, because we talked in the previous panel a little bit about the limits of policies and regulations, but also there's a lot to be done by companies and inside corporations of how to actively fight AI scams. So let's be optimistic in this panel and try to find the solutions that are already implemented or solutions that are about to be implemented by the main actors. So I want to, just before diving into this discussion, just to understand the scale of the threat we're talking about. Because when we talk about AI, something that we said months ago is already very obsolete, and the scale of the rapid pace of innovation in the scam is very sometimes scary. So what are the threats that you've seen developing over the last 12, 18 months when it comes to the increased scammy aspect of AI-powered scams? Who wants to start? Abigail?
Sure. I think taking just a step back here to answer that question, it's really important to think about the broader context of innovation. And the kind of consistent use of any innovation that is launched, that scammers will find a way to exploit it. It is not a new phenomena, but the speed at which innovation broadly happens is directly in correlation with the speed in which scammers will find ways to manipulate those legitimate services and tools. One of the things that I reflect on and I have mixed feelings on, but I think about often is the sort of notion of AI being the fourth industrial revolution, right? And I love this session and I love this whole event and sort of the idea of, yes, scammers are using AI, but so are good guys, because it is a tool, just like any other previous industrial revolution. And so I think to unpack what the scale and the impact is for scams, you have to kind of look more broadly at how innovation is moving so quickly nowadays writ large.
Nick, what are you guys struggling with when it comes to these AI-powered scams?
Yeah, I think the things that we see is, like Abigail said, the adversary is using these tools for efficiency. Like, they're making scams more personal, more convincing, be able to do and create content faster. A lot of the ways legitimate businesses are universities every single day. So they're adopting this technology at the same time at that rapid pace. I think where I also see, and where Abigail also got to, is the major technology companies, the sources of these innovations, we're deploying that technology ourselves to be able to detect it, be able to categorize it at scale, make it faster, drive better decision-making for ourselves, discover new scams as well across all of the range of things that we see.
Mike, what's your take on this rapid pace of AI-powered scams, and when you try to tackle, when companies try to tackle it, it's just already obsolete in terms of the solutions, and always trying to innovate in tackling AI.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're certainly seeing that fraudsters are using AI to supercharge their scams, right? In the texting space, we see, they may be using it to more quickly send spammy and scammy text messages at higher volumes, right? It, offers the ability for them to more rapidly personalize the content of scam messages to try to get through filters. So we see that. Nick and Abigail have talked about how I think there's also, positive ways that industry can push back on this. And I know certainly for the wireless industry, we feel like we're better positioned than ever to try to combat these efforts, including scams that are leveraging AI. The wireless industry has built up robust tools against robocalls and robotexts. In the voice space, there's significant work that's been done to try to label, identify, and block illegal robocalls so that users have more control over, do I answer this call or not? In the texting space, there's been a lot of work to, through upfront vetting and registration requirements to try to keep bad actors off the platform, build in filtering and blocking tools to prevent messages from getting through, consumer reporting tools so that if a message does hit your device, you can provide feedback to wireless providers so that that can inform anti-spam efforts. And a lot of it comes down to information sharing, which is something I think we'll talk about today as well. So I think there's a strong foundation in the wireless industry already when it comes to protecting consumers from robocalls and robotexts, but we're constantly enhancing our tools and our policies, and that includes leveraging AI technologies. And so we know the bad actors are using it, but we're using it ourselves as well.
Fernando, what have you seen at FICO over the last 12 months in terms of increased?
So I do believe like that all of us in our organizations are making a really strong front in advancing the technologies. But just as Nick and Abigail had said, the fraudsters are taking advantage of themselves. I might sound doom and gloom, but just to give there is an avalanche coming. And from our perspective, if you take Pix, which was the real-time rails, so it's very similar to Zelle in the United States. They have an acceptance rate of about 91 to 93% of the population that are using it. The minute that was introduced into the community, into the population, actually 64 to 70% of the entire users were compromised within a couple of months. So fraudsters are taking absolute advantage of it. Where I'm from in Canada, in 2023, the government actually made an attempt, the RCMP, the equivalent to the FBI here, actually tried to calculate what the fraud losses were. And at that time, it was about $9 million. Well, at the end of 2024, it now accounts for about $120 million. So it's growing dramatically. I think, yes, they are taking advantage of new technologies, but just like the four of us are saying, we're not sitting down. There's techniques, there's new data elements, and that are being provided in the market. It's how we take advantage of that and empower not just the financial institutions, but different organizations, as well as the consumer. We do a survey every year, and in our latest survey in the United States, 51% of the population in the U.S. has experience or knows someone who has been involved in a scam. But what is also interesting is that a little over 72%, they're actually expecting to be challenged for every transaction. And 90% are actually expecting us to be able to monitor those transactions and be able to tell them or advise them if there's something suspicious happening. Yeah.
So yeah, you said you guys not sitting down, of course, because the amount of fraud and the complexity or the intelligence of scams is just push for reaction. So let's deep dive into the actual capabilities that you have and you're developing, guys, in terms of like, okay, what kind of tools? Talk to us about what kind of tools you're putting and what kind of capabilities you have in order to address those issues. Nick?
So I think of them in two ways. They're the capabilities that we have within our business and then those that we help consumers make decisions about. So within our business, the large language models do really well at tagging and labeling things, providing context to the type of scam content that we see. Deepfake ads is an example, right? You might see a deepfake about a celebrity or a politician, depending on what market you live in. And we've been using AI technology, LLMs, to help us understand those since 2019. And what it really does is help to scale up, where we had human reviewers looking at these types of advertisements. We now have them augmented by AI, helping to really categorize this information. And as slowly over time, we're able to add to the process of, okay, we want to make better automated decisions about this. I think there's other things we're doing too on consumer devices. And earlier this year, we announced some additional capabilities on Android related to what consumers see on messages that could be scammy, as well as phone calls. They get an alert related to that. And at its core, it's the same sort of LLM technology that we're using inside the business to be able to detect these scams. The great thing about where we have with Android is we're able to rely on some of these models that are on the device to be able to do this quickly and at scale.
Yeah, that's very interesting because you just said that at the scale of the scams, the human moderation is just almost too slow. It's not scalable.
Well, we see that everywhere, right? We see that, maps, right, are a great example of where we've seen a lot of spammy, scam type content before. Maps is a very strong legacy Google product, and we're able, those capabilities that we've developed for some of our other products, we're bringing them to bear across our entire business.
So it's AI scalability will address the AI scams, and that's what we're going into. Abigail, do you want to, what type of capabilities do you have and you're developing?
Yeah, well, at Amazon, we often think about the types of scams that our customers and consumers are broadly facing as being both on and off of our store. On our store are things like making sure that our authentic reviews are prevalent. We're using LLMs and other AI technologies to identify suspicious reviews. And in fact, before reviews are even posted, 100% of our reviews are authenticated using AI and human signals. And to give, I think it's also like a little bit of a nod at what we're up against. Just last year, we blocked something like 250 million suspected fake reviews from even coming onto our store in the first place. And so those are types of deceptive tactics that bad actors are using. And because they're using them attempting to using them on our store, we have a lot of insight into them. We have a lot of controls at our disposal to combat them. Where it gets hinky and where it gets especially challenging and where we are very much digging into are the off-store scams. The scams that look like often impersonation. So quick internal scan of the room. How many people here have received a text or email saying somebody was from somewhere that they weren't? Yeah, all of those. It's really hard to keep up with, right? And Amazon, unfortunately, is a really attractive brand to these scammers, and scammers will impersonate us all the time. And so way that our AI tools kind of come into play on the off-store side is both in the front end and on the back end of the consumer experience. So what I mean by that is on the front end, we're doing a lot of detection. We're taking down URLs that are phishing consumers, right? Last year, we took 55,000 websites down. We helped initiate over 12,000 malicious phone numbers that we've identified. And we're getting better. Like even just recently, we launched some technology that has helped us get a reduction in about 10% of additional URLs. And so we're iterating, we're learning, just like I was saying about the industrial evolution nature of AI, it is constantly evolving. The other thing that I would point to is, we have some ways to go, and that's not just Amazon here, where we're struggling and where I think we have an opportunity to improve collectively. My colleagues on the stage and out in the audience, is more around that just in time, that real time, right? Like that is where we have a gap right now, in our ability to help people in the moment, right? And that is where we should be sort of thinking about how do we help people when they're experiencing a scam? And how do we help them tune into it in real time? Just to kind of close out, on the back end of a scam, we also use AI to analyze and cull through a ton of data on what our customers report back to us, especially on impersonation scams. It's a ton of information. It's really important that we're able to distill trends. We're able to pick up on where there's some overlap, and we're able to coordinate then with law enforcement and other organizations to go after those bad actors. But again, that middle piece, that piece where the scam is happening, that is something that I think needs to get sharper as we go forward.
Thank you. Mike, what do you see of the actual capabilities across tech platforms when it comes to AI fraud detections? And of course, it's building up and powering up, but where are we?
Yeah, I think the way the wireless industry thinks about it is that AI technologies are one part of a much deeper toolkit that we have to protect consumers from robocalls, robotexts, all of these spam and scam interactions that they can engage with. Previously I mentioned sort of a lot of the traditional tools that we have on the voice calling side, right? Labeling, blocking, giving consumers more control over what calls they answer. I talked about the multi-pronged effort that we have around text messaging, on the front end to try to weed out bad actors from ever getting on the platform, making sure that, scammy messages don't get through to consumers, giving them the tools to report information. Those are all part of the toolkit, and we have found that even some of those more traditional tools are effective against AI enhanced scams. But AI tools are also a big part of the toolkit. And on the wireless provider side, they're using AI technologies to be able to analyze really vast quantities of network data, and that helps them to identify patterns, right? And it enables them to detect scams faster and earlier. So a lot of that is happening at the network level. There are also, companies that offer robocall or robotext mitigation services that are using AI technologies as well. Companies like First Orion or Haya in the calling space, they use AI technologies to be able to detect, an AI-generated voice or an AI-augmented voice. And enables them to take faster action against scams like that. But again, it's also just one piece of the toolkit because we know messages and calls are still getting through. So one of the other big parts of that toolkit that we think about is information sharing. And there's been a lot of effort across industry, within the wireless industry and across other industry sectors to try to build up that information sharing so that when we do see something, we can go after the bad guys and try to shut it down more effectively. In the voice space, the Industry Traceback Group has played a pivotal role here in being able to, trace the path of illegal robocalls, identify where they're coming from, shut them down. In the texting space, CTIA runs the Secure Messaging Initiative, and it convenes folks across the ecosystem to try to share information about what we've seen. We use that as a mechanism to then be able to share information not only within the ecosystem, but also with law enforcement. And we've, packaged a number of referrals for law enforcement. We've done over 20 referrals on, a number of high-profile scams, including some that we strongly suspect are using AI technologies. These are probably a lot of the scams that you all have seen on your phones, right? Toll road scams, package delivery, student loan scams. Through that process, we've been able to trace back over 200,000 text messages as part of that effort. So again, it's part of a broader toolkit. We're constantly evolving what that toolkit is and enhancing our tools. But AI technologies certainly are something that is front and center for wireless providers and others across the ecosystem.
One of the points that you mentioned is that it's interesting to see those toolkit being developed in-house in companies, but also almost like a new economy of startups, of like new company being truly focused on detecting AI. And so you can also, like large tech companies or smaller, can also outsource and have some solutions that are provided on the market in order to detect scams. Anyone wants to chime in on that?
I
Also
mean,
a new economy.
dare we call it an industrial revolution, right? Like,
That's part of the ecosystem, right?
I think you're making a good point because there isn't a single silver bullet to everything, right? It's always from what we've seen. It's always been a layered approach. It's the smarts of Google, the smarts of Amazon, the data that's out there, marrying it with the different analytic techniques, whether it's behavior sorted listings, to understand the behavior of the transaction or the interaction between that consumer.
Yeah, that's and data and behavioral. Precisely, I want to nudge into the behavioral aspect of scams, because the National Consumer Leagues have done that for many years, like identity theft, right? We know the old school of identity theft, and of course that there's the new technological tools with AI that just make identity theft so perfect. I mean, it's just like it's hard, as the former panel explained, it's hard not to be lured into these to this scam. So, how can behavioral analysis? How can we nudge the nudge, and how can we precisely outsmart the nudging capabilities that those scammers may have, because they really use data and behavioral capabilities, right? So, has any of you like looked at how we can use behavioral analysis and nudging in order to prevent this perfect identity theft sometimes? So, Fernando?
Yeah, you can definitely talk about how we're helping prevent and detect those types of patterns. So we've actually been building fraud analytic prevention and detection models for well over 35 years. Right, today they protect about 3 billion accounts globally. What we've done, and very recently in some new innovations, is understanding who the money that you might send to somebody, right, or the money that you might be receiving as well too. We look at against our consortium. We used supervised neural networks to understand, is that within somebody's pattern. We compare also to understand whether the person receiving the money might be within their pattern as well too. Is it a mule account? And when we're able to score, what we've done is been able to separate the two. Two meaning that we understand that there's a third party fraud that might be happening, where it could be an account takeover. I might have taken your information and now conducting that type of fraud. But then when we talk about scams, there's the instance where it's myself or my mother is actually sending money to the fraudster because she's been duped. Either they've been using AI or to be able to search the internet to figure out details about myself, to be able to impersonate my credentials, to be able to convince my mother, or using AI to generate a voice to be able to copy my voice that might be on a video somewhere on social media that they're able to then pattern out and then fake as my voice to be able to tell her to send money. But then we use these techniques to be able to understand the movement of that money, and also even non-monetary information, whether there's information shared such as password changes or telephone number changes, to include that in that evaluation. What has been extremely successful, which we've seen with the likes with Santander, is that once we've scored those transactions and understand the behavior of being out of sync of what you've normally doing, even it's you that's conducting that transaction, is that then we're able to then cooperate with the telecommunication network providers, to be able to understand who that person's speaking with at that time or recently. Have they been texting a number that's been commonly used, or communicating commonly used? Has that conversation lasted? My text, your text probably maybe it lasts a couple of seconds or a minute. And why is this conversation or voice conversation happening over time, over several minutes? The way I look at it, it's, we're taking a combination of doing the profiling, understanding the behavior, and making sure that the organization or financial institutions making the right decision. But I don't think it stops there. I do think that there's also an education process that needs to happen to close the loop, because like I mentioned before, a lot of the consumers are expecting some sort of friction or some sort of challenge. So if we can reach out to them digitally, to have a digital communication, to provide almost like a white glove treatment with them, I think the reception becomes even much more powerful. And then you're able to store those preferences so that you can reach the consumer every time, because they are expecting to be notified if we do think that the fraud is actually occurring.
That's very interesting, because in the impersonification of deepfake, what you mentioned is like by data patterns, so like almost identifying outliers, you can identify the scam. So it's more not the outcome, but this impersonation will lead to something, monetary transactions or data transactions, and that's where you can intervene, not necessarily on the impersonification, but you stop the damaging consequences of these deepfake or impersonifications. Any comments on this, like trying to learn from data patterns and those suspicious activities that you can turn down?
Yeah, we like data a lot at Amazon. And just to kind of give everyone here a little bit of like a peek behind the curtain, it is not just lip service. At Amazon, we approach our product development process working backwards from the customer. And so any new challenge that a customer is facing in navigating our store or their sort of online shopping experience, we are factoring in vulnerabilities and sensitivities and ways that our legitimate services and communications could get manipulated or misused. And so it is increasingly, particularly on the AI front, absolutely central to our product development process overall. We are factoring in the questions of, now, how would bad actors try to use this for their own gain? And so the more that we can, again, work backwards from the customer experience, factoring in both the ability to apply AI to mitigate those vulnerabilities, but also thinking about how they could potentially be manipulated using AI amongst other tools. As Mike said, AI is a tool, is absolutely central to any product development, whether it's at Amazon or elsewhere, moving forward.
No, I think one of the other areas to think about too, like thinking about a layered approach to this, is how the companies are able to share data together to be able to get some of this behavior analysis and to do that at scale. And one of the things that Google did over the last year was stand up along with the Global Anti-Scams Alliance, is a global signals exchange. So it's a multi-sector group, multi-company, sharing data from across different domains to be able to get insights into scammers more broadly. I think where the advantage in that is that we're taking the aperture beyond what we see within our own data. And hopefully the bet is that we're able to apply the same sort of behavioral detection that we do on our own technologies with this now shared data set, and are able to expand how we are going after these scammers. Abigail mentioned earlier, right? Like, these scammers aren't just staying on Amazon or Google or on your bank or your messaging. Like, these scams often span different social media networks or technologies. So that's where I think the importance is in starting to share this information more frequently, more in real time, and applying these technologies that we have on the AI and behavioral science side across to detect these new patterns across technology.
Some sort of alliance so that the industry can move forward.
Right, and we've seen this on the cybersecurity side. I was a cybersecurity guy before this, and there's information sharing groups there that are across different sectors, within sectors, to help drive forward these kind of detection. So there's a basis for this on how this can work in the private sector.
Can I just also? It's such a good point, and I'm a personally and as an Amazon representative, I think we're collectively really excited about the promise and the bet, as you put it, on the Global Signal Exchange. If you're not familiar with it, highly recommend checking it out. It's a really impressive, fast-moving initiative, but at the same time, like, as exciting as some of these initiatives are, know that information sharing is already happening. and we can get better, and there's initiatives out there that are kind of spurring us forward, which is terrific. But information sharing is happening across sectors, across jurisdictions, and it's often used for both detection and going after bad actors. Even, Amazon's worked with Microsoft and others to develop really compelling cases to bring to law enforcement over the years. And so we also share insights publicly. At least at Amazon, we share insights from our own scam trends publicly, so that we can make sure that others know what things we're seeing uptick from our vantage point. Not that it's a fait accompli, but it's contributing to sort of the pulse of what's going on. So anyways, just to underscore that point, information sharing is happening. It's just getting, I think, more interesting, faster, and better.
Mike, you're well placed to see this industry view. Tell us about this kind of alliance or industry-wide initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, maybe to start, I'll go back to something Nick said, which is, a lot of these scams, we see them migrating, right? And the bad actors they're smart, they're quick, they are very innovative. They're constantly evolving how they are trying to, defraud consumers.
If only they would use their innovation for good.
That's right.
And
That's right. But a scam that might start with a phone call or a text message might very quickly migrate to an external website or an over-the-top application that maybe the wireless industry doesn't have the same kind of reach into. And so, in those instances, I think information sharing becomes that much more critical, because it's the way that we can share information across industry sectors, and ultimately the goal is to get out the bad guys, to shut them down, right? And we've heard about some of the examples that already exist. I mentioned the CTIA's Secure Messaging Initiative. That's one example that we use not only within the wireless industry to share information between wireless providers, aggregators, and others who sort of work in the messaging path, but we're also using that as a way to share information across sectors. We've been doing a lot of work to try to share information with the financial sector, for example. And there was one study that showed when the financial industry shares scam information with the wireless industry, there's a 90% drop in consumer complaints related to those scams because of actions that the wireless industry can take in shutting those actors down, getting them off the network, blocking those messages. It's just one example, but we're constantly looking for opportunities to try to beef up that cross-sector information sharing. CTIA participates, and I think a number of the organizations here participate in the Aspen Institute's Anti-Fraud Task Force. That's a really promising effort. We know that group has been focused not only on developing, what a potential national strategy, anti-scam strategy could look like, but one of the really critical things they've been focusing on is, are there certain barriers from a legal or regulatory perspective to information sharing, and what opportunities are there for trying to streamline some of that. So we're excited about that work stream. We're actively engaged there. Our understanding is they're going to be putting out some recommendations later this fall, so we're very eager to see what that looks like. But I would also say, even events like this and the work that John and NCL has done to bring folks together, it's a great opportunity, across industry sectors to hear what folks are doing. So that really is a critical piece for going after bad actors and really trying to make a meaningful dent in fraudulent and scammy messages.
Information sharing is so important because precisely the scammers thrive on those obstacles and the lack of accountability or the lack of coordinations. They thrive on the inability for companies or enforcers to tackle them. Abigail?
I'll just add something that I think was touched on in the earlier panel, but I just want to call out explicitly is like the cross-sector information sharing piece is really difficult, and people are active in trying to make it less difficult. The other piece that is challenging with information sharing is jurisdictional coordination. And so my remit is global, and so I have both the challenge and opportunity to think about how can we connect these efforts across the world to really make an impact. Bad actors are absolutely working transnationally. They are crossing borders to their own benefit. It makes law enforcement, it is very challenging for law enforcement to keep up with these things. Not all sectors talk to each other, and not all government and law enforcement agencies talk to each other, turns out. And so it is a massive opportunity for us to work together. And it even comes down acutely, I think, in the US when you think about the different layers of jurisdictional oversight from sort of the local, state, federal level as well. And just to shameless plug for an effort that I am very excited about. It's called the National Elder Fraud Coordination Center. You can go ahead and look that up. It's an effort that has just kicked off with Walmart and Amazon and AARP and another tech startup called Google.
Small company.
We are kind of modeling this effort after NCMEC. For those that are familiar with that, it's actually being incubated within the NCFTA organization. If you're familiar with, I'm just going to throw a bunch of acronyms at you and hope that you write them down. If not, you can find me afterwards. But the NCFTA. In an effort to within the United States, pull together information that makes it very actionable for law enforcement on every level. And so that's a really exciting piece as well. But that jurisdictional and that cross-jurisdictional coordination on top of the cross-sector coordination is tough.
Absolutely. I think you mentioned the cross-border nature of this and makes it extremely hard, I think. And what we're looking forward to is just continuation of those efforts across the board, because these criminals aren't working from one location and just targeting individuals in that country that they're in. This is an internationalized operation that they're able to conduct. They're operating like businesses. They're going to lower cost locations using the internet for access, just like they have for other crimes, to be able to do this. So it's really important to drive to that cross-border work overall, so that the work that these our industry partners are able to do doesn't just fall for naught as we're trying to get action.
But what I do think is that there is still a shining light, right? With every challenge, there's sparks innovation. I think what you said earlier with a lot of the whether it's a fintech or startups that are coming up, they're innovatively introducing new techniques and new ways to share summarized information across the board, right? I agree that it is difficult today, right? Whether it's for Canada to share their safe harbor with the UK, with the United States, it runs into issues, right? Whether it's privacy or PIBITA or just PII information, but some of these startups they've been fantastic and be able to, whether it's BioCatch, whether it's ThreatMetrix, and even some of the local ones like Prove and JT Telecom, it's given the ability for the organizations here in the United States to empower themselves, be able to get to point B faster, even though it's not in the right format. I like what my colleagues are speaking of. It's definitely the right direction, but there's also a small step that we can take to defeat the fraud.
Yeah, these jurisdictional challenges can create a whole new economy again with startups that can challenge. But of course, we need to align incentives, and those good guys needs to be even better incentivized, and that's where perhaps also regulators can have this carrot and stick and improve the incentives by increasing the rewards and increasing the fines, and so that we can tell apart the good guys and the bad guys. And that's where policymakers may have also a role in aligning and increasing the incentives even better when it comes to detections and fraud. Before getting to precisely policy and regulations, there's one thing, like when we talk about fraud detections, there's one risk for any kind of interventions, human interventions or AI interventions to so-called fraud or scam, is the risks of false positives or false negatives. And how do you guys have internal processes or appeals mechanism or whatever you call it internally to say like, hey, sometimes there might be some false positive, right? We over censor, we over take down, or sometimes some false negatives that we think it's real and when it's scam. And so how do you build internal corporate appeals mechanisms so that victims or non-victims can kind of challenge some of the decisions that have made? Abigail?
I think with AI just generally, one of the terms that I'm increasingly familiar with as we apply AI and mitigate risks associated with it as well is the term hallucinations. Anybody hear about hallucinations in reference to AI? Yeah, it's when like AI gets weird on us and starts making things up. And you're like, wait, what? It sort of, you know, gaslights you into like some like, wait a second. That is something that's real. And I think is really anecdotal to a broader sort of approach that we use at Amazon, which is like, AI is not just running off doing things. Like it's like an AI like agent off running. Like there is sort of the agentic AI that you sort of enable to make decisions on its own, which is like a whole separate conversation. But particularly for generative AI, you have tremendous human oversight. And so as we're building and deploying our AI tools and products, we are also factoring in at what point is human oversight and direction and course correction absolutely critical. And so when we're thinking about AI, I think it is not AI alone. It is AI with human engagement and human direction moving forward. And so I imagine my colleagues have similar sort of.
Absolutely. It's not like you let your kids just run amok on the house. Right?
Sometimes I do. It's just.
There is oversight of it, but it's also, and I think Amazon would take this approach as well, it's augmenting the business processes that
Absolutely.
they have to do.
Yep.
There's a human
Yep.
review in the process. There's multiple layers of oversight within it. And I think the other part of that is a robust appeals process, like you were discussing, that is universally available if there are mistakes made so that people are able to appeal. And I think that's a critical part of the function as well. And that also can be another signal, right? User feedback is critical for us to get an understanding, hey, there's a new scam out there. There are areas that we're missing in our models. And those can be another behavioral sign for us to integrate into the AI systems.
Mike, what do you see in terms of appeal mechanism and tackling the false positives and false negatives?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big focus for the wireless industry. You know, we try to strike a very careful balance between consumer protection, but also ensuring that, you know, legitimate message senders can continue to send traffic. You know, we work with the wireless industry works to support a wide variety of messaging use cases. We work with a wide variety of sort of different categories of message senders, right, to make sure that they can communicate with their customers the way they want to. And sort of to kind of illustrate the scale of what we're dealing with, last year the wireless providers in the US blocked 55 billion scam and spam text messages. These are messages we know consumers don't want to receive. But we facilitated the exchange of over 2.4 trillion text messages. So getting that balance right is really important. You know, wireless providers, they have points of contact where a message sender can reach out if they feel like they've been subject to erroneous blocking. There are mechanisms in place for dealing with that. There are also tools built into the devices that consumers are using that are really useful for us, right? There are consumer reporting tools on Apple and Google phones that folks use every day, and
But where does it go?
so
Where does it go?
the information there goes to wireless providers, and there's a feedback mechanism, and they're constantly using that to enhance their filtering and make sure that they're getting it right. And it's a great way for consumers to tell us, are we getting this right or not? And so it's empowering consumers to share information, but it's also creating a mechanism for those message senders to say, wait a minute, we think we've been erroneously blocked. And there's a clear points of contact that they can go to. But striking that balance is really critical, and it's something that we are constantly it's constantly evolving. We're constantly updating our practices to make sure we're getting that balance exactly the right way that it should be.
And then that may require some human capital, human interventions. Fernando, what about the internal appeal mechanisms, and how do you precisely avoid false positives as well?
Yeah, I'll talk about a couple of techniques that we're taking, but also something that we're trying to tackle as well too. One, very similar to what Nick and Abigail had mentioned. Definitely incorporating the human intervention as part of it, and human guidance. So taking our fraud knowledge over the course of the 2-3 decades, and inputting that as part of our knowledge base, and making sure that's updated. We've developed our own taxonomy, fraud taxonomy, about what those definitions are, and are constantly improving on it. The other one is also incorporating process documents to understand, what are the guidelines or some of the limitations around this space for that financial institution to best address it. But what has been incredibly important is also, I love large language models, but what we've seen very powerful is actually focused language models. And I know you're going to get into it about regulatory as well too, but the idea of focused language models is that we are taking a little bit of a supervised approach. Supervised approach so that everything's explainable. We understand what data sets for a particular business. So if it's a financial institution, understanding financial transactions as part of that limitation without going all across a much larger data source that will generate hallucinations. That has helped incredibly in being able to create that better precision. But then the big problem to tackle is, am I capturing all the information? Because let's face it, right? It's human nature that if you were a scam victim, there's a high possibility that you're not going to report it because of embarrassment or shame. And how do I get that information to be brought in? Because the more tags, the more information that I have to understand, these are the particular criteria for a specific fraud scam definition, whether it's courier fraud or elderly fraud. I want to make sure I'm capturing that right information so that I can better detect it later.
Yeah, consumer reporting, internal reporting is critical for accuracy at the end in fraud detection.
Right, and how can we eliminate that shame so that the person's able to report it? And a lot of the things that we've seen is that financial institutions are now taking that step. They're either in certain regions saying you will not be held liable for it, right? Or trying to provide better education, and education through any channels, whether it's through a digital contact communication, whether it's on their website, or any material or channel that they have access to.
We touched upon the jurisdictional challenges when it comes to enforcement, and of course, because everything we're talking about here is global, it's not in America, it's not domestic or even less local. And so that touches upon of collaboration with enforcers and policymakers and regulators more generally. To be constructive and to have some ideas, food for thought for regulators and policymakers, what would be your policy recommendations, either hard law or soft law guidance from authorities, from different departments? What would be your policy recommendations that you wish to see thriving, both domestically in the US, but also in terms of international coordination? Abigail?
I think there's at least a couple things that are good starting points for how we're thinking about opportunities to make an impact in protecting consumers from scams. I think one is to incentivize cross-jurisdictional cooperation, find ways and mechanisms for both within the US and also abroad for policymakers to work collaboratively in terms of making regulations, but also in terms of holding bad actors accountable. And so the more that we can formalize and build that muscle memory of cooperation across agencies and countries, I think is really critical. The second piece is just like the nature of AI being so dynamic, companies and other organizations who are working dutifully to address this challenge for consumers and their customers, we're still learning and we still have a ways to go. And so what gives me a little bit of the heebie-jeebs is when I come across draft legislation or regulations that are incredibly well-intended, and this is not isolated to the US, I've seen this all over the world, but they're overly prescriptive. It's like a certain amount of clicks or a certain amount of, location of information or a, process. And I understand the intent, but there needs to be more experimentation. And we need to figure out and be incentivized to learn and to invest resources to get better faster. And so to the extent that, and I know some of the folks who are here from policy, so I'm kind of looking at you guys. But to the extent that you're listening, really encourage you just across the board to encourage us to continue to be creative.
Nick?
I think one area, and Abigail, building off of what you said, is what is oftentimes unhelpful is a focus on turnaround time and like being super prescriptive on the speed that has to be done. I think, because these technologies are new, because our adversaries are using them, I think being able to shift that from saying, hey, this needs to be done expeditiously, this needs to be done at a certain pace, I think helps drive that going forward, rather than being incredibly prescriptive that this needs to be done in 15 minutes once you're able to do that. I mean,
why not 14 minutes?
Why not 14?
That's what I want to know.
Certainly areas like that are threat to life that are very different, but like in this space, I think given the volumes, like the timelines need to be adjustable or appropriate to be able to be done expeditiously.
Mike, what's your perspective on policy in the US, but also international coordination with all the policymakers? Because we know things are happening, let's say, in Europe with the AI Act. So tell us about your perspective.
Yeah, as Abigail and Nick said, I think the innovation in the AI space has been really impressive and is really important. And I think we've seen that the ability for the wireless industry to innovate and keep up with bad actors, including responsibly leveraging AI technologies, has been really critical. And so I think making sure that our posture continues to support that kind of innovation is really important. In that respect, we were very pleased by the administration's AI action plan. We're very pleased by efforts to try to avoid patchwork of state AI legislation that could slow down and hinder some of the innovation that we've seen. We've been pleased, here in the U.S. at the FCC level with some of the clear guidance that they have provided on a rapid manner in terms of how AI technologies fit within, for example, the TCPA or existing FCC rules. That kind of swift clarity is important. And I think, at a higher level, our perspective is that, government largely has been able to keep up and has the tools that it needs to respond to some of these AI challenges. One of the clear examples that we point to was the Biden robocall that occurred in New Hampshire last year ahead of the primary. where right after that, the FCC was able to come out and clarify that yes, AI technologies are subject to FCC rules. We've seen the FTC put out guidance and adopt rules focused on impersonation scams and other fraud scams that's helpful. So we think government does have a lot of the tools that it needs. So one of the things we would caution is to not sort of rush into additional legislation or regulations. There are areas where we think government can be helpful here. I think one of the really critical things that we've talked about is enforcement. It's something that CTIA has always said, but we think there need to be more resources given for enforcement so that the agencies that have jurisdiction and the expertise have the resources they need to go after bad actors in an effective manner. I also think Congress has a role to play. I talked about the Aspen Institute's anti-fraud task force and their push for a national strategy. We think there's a lot of promise there, but there's probably going to need to be congressional action to support some of that. I think Congress also can play a really important role in supporting efforts that folks across industry are doing to empower consumers with more education and more resources, and so there may be something that Congress can do there. But I think really leaning into the ability for industry to continue innovating and keeping up with these bad actors that we know are nimble and moving fast is really important.
What's your take to the whole panel about the interactions between federal and state type of regulations? There's some concern about saying, well, we should perhaps have a preemptions, and then it should have at least one size fits all. If it's a regulatory approach, that's what we saw recently with the White House plan. But more generally, we're not talking about hard law. We're talking about soft law instruments so far. But should there be something closer to a hard law instrument? What would be your stake in terms of the federal/state type of approach, and how the industry will react to precisely a risk for regulatory fragmentation in the U.S.? Anyone want to chime in on this state federal approach? Mike?
I mean, I can just sort of to echo the point I made earlier. I think we have seen there's been a rush at the state level to regulate and adopt legislation on AI. And I think there's a real risk that you will have a patchwork of conflicting rules and obligations that will make it really challenging for companies to continue trying to, engage in the consumer protection practices that they are right now. And so trying to avoid that patchwork, I think, is really critical. The specific mechanism for doing so, I'll leave to, experts that deal with that issue, but I think that patchwork could be really problematic for businesses.
Any Fernando on policy?
Well, definitely on policy. I think what my colleagues had mentioned, I've seen it in action, actually working in other countries, right? And I'll only speak from the financial services point of view, but when there's an incentive for a financial institution to be able to enact and almost to agree where they organically become self-policing as well too, it's very encouraging, and I think those policies do work and do work well. Initially when scam was completely out of their control in the United Kingdom, they didn't know where to begin, right? They didn't understand whether they need to also align with the EU's initiatives as well, which were happening quite slowly. But because with the problem occurring, they started, let's start understanding where the liability is. That actually then forced the organizations to develop their new AI strategies, especially when it came to scams. Also, when enacting where the liability begins, how much of the liability is belonging to each organization that's participating in. Because very similar in the States, if you're an RDFI, which is a receiving institution, you're not responsible for the fraud, right? And so it was determined, let's make it 50-50, right? That equitability then forced the organizations to start sharing and actually start joint liability. What is also interesting as well too, it also forced them, which is happening very much in Canada as well, is how can we create better transparency for our AI models? So if a individual wants to appeal or wants to better understand how their information is being used or how the judgment's being done, now the financial institutions are able to articulate it, and I'm seeing that here happen in the United States as well. The financial institutions have taken a very hard stance in making sure everything that they do, all of the AI models that they're building, are much more explainable. They're also taking initiatives to make the advancement to incorporate more data, even outside of the current U.S. as well too. So I think I still think there's a lot more work to be done, because as the new technology advances, there's going to be new techniques that need to be policed.
Can I just add? It just struck me as we were talking about the UK model for a second. One of the things that recent law has evoked, unfortunately, is and not surprisingly, is exploitation by scammers. And so that is another wrinkle, just like us developing products and services for consumers and customers, but also for policymakers developing laws and regulations, is what are the workarounds that these bad actors are going to find to exploit whatever rules you're putting forward? And that is hard. That is really hard work. But it's super real and relevant, because we all, whether you're on the private sector or in the public sector, we all have to think about how the things that we are putting into motion are going to be used against consumers. And so I think that is just another dimension of some of the spirit of caution that many of us are putting forward, is that bad actors are also exploiting these rules in the shadows.
Abigail, I'm glad you brought that up. Like in 2023 in the UK, the policymakers decided to publish the performance of each financial institution and what they're reporting and how much they're providing restitution to the client. And exactly that, the fraudsters took advantage of it. They found out, oh, well, this bank A is actually refunding the client quicker. Because again, they're including time and the percentage that they're refunding in total of cases. All of a sudden, all the fraud gravitated to that bank, where now everyone was saying, I didn't do that transaction. I don't know who I sent that money to. So I think you're absolutely spot on.
The unintended consequences of sometime enforcement and regulations. I just want to open it for questions from the floor. We have a few minutes left. I'm sure there's maybe a lot of interesting questions from the many topics we've covered. A number of questions. We have some mics coming in. Yes, just right here. A couple of questions. Neil, yeah. Neil is part of the Competition Innovation Lab, is senior fellow. He's also at the inception of this conference, making the link with the National Consumer Leagues, a long-time member of the league.
So it's doubly a pleasure to be here and hear everything that this panel has to say. I was really struck by your discussion of what you're doing on the deterrent front, as distinct from the defensive front in AI. And I wondered if you could unpack that a little bit. You mentioned that you had assembled packages of material to give to law enforcement agencies for them to follow up with the worst of the actors. I think someone mentioned you had one group of 20 submissions. Could you elaborate a bit on that? How well did that work? In what percentage of the cases did the law enforcement agency act? Are there some agencies that are more responsive than others? Have you learned something about what material you need to have in the package to give the agency to persuade them to act? Thank you.
Nick, I'm not going to name drop because that wouldn't be very nice. But there are some agencies who work faster, better, and are more resourced to their defense than others. When you say deterrent, just to put a finer point on it, these law enforcement cases are not deterrents to bad actors from doing their shady business, actually. Unfortunately, the moment that you launch a case, oftentimes it enters into sort of the intelligence sharing on the dark web, where bad actors are keeping up with who's doing what, where, when. And so it's less of a deterrent, but it is something that is important to do nonetheless. One example of how this looks that I can share to kind of paint a picture of this more acutely is a couple years back, Amazon and Microsoft, and I referenced this earlier, got together and they started picking up on shared signals of bad actors reaching out to consumers. And many of them were Amazon customers in this case, and Microsoft customers. And together we were able to kind of responsibly exchange intelligence together to pinpoint sort of the scale and nexus of these operations. And in doing that, worked very closely with the CBI, which is the Indian version of the FBI, to go and raid over 70 call centers across India. And when we say call centers, this isn't like a shopping mall. This is like a skyscraper of bad actors who are reaching out to consumers. And so that's sort of the scale and the opportunity that's in front of us with some of that sort of intelligence sharing on the enforcement side.
Thank you. Any other questions? There was one question here.
Thank you. Christine Kiefer with the Venner Foundation. One is a comment and the other is a quick question. You mentioned about how do we encourage more people to report, and what Abigail just said is one of those things. When people don't see action being taken, they don't report as well. So it's not just that there's shame, because there is, but our data and the research we continue to do on this shows that one of the bigger factors is that nothing will come of it. So the more we represent that something comes of it, the more we also encourage. But so the question is this. You talked a lot about what you're doing in your organizations and cross industries to use AI for good. And I know consumer education is not the answer to combat scams, but it's one part of the equation. And certainly there's organizations or entities that are starting to say, how do we use AI to intervene in the moment, right, Abigail? You talked about that. So the question is, if AI can be trained, which it is, I've run pitches through AI and said, is this a scam? And I've had really great responses and lots of very victim-centered language, and it's all been great. But can the scammers then behind the scenes be manipulating the AI to create false negatives, so that if we were to utilize AI as a consumer education intervention tool, could it be being manipulated to hide the scams too? Is that evidence for when you need some sort of closed system like you were talking about?
I will just say, and I'm sorry, I will let out, the ability to authenticate whether a communication is real is like the number one thing we hear from our customers. Like, how do I know it's really you guys? Right? And so it's a challenge to all of us here to find ways and tools and products and develop mechanisms to help answer that question. But I think that is a real risk for open source AI tools.
I think there is a risk with that on some of the tools, and answers you might see skewing that direction. I think the other side is that the level of model training from the big companies around this on the data that we are pulling in helps to mitigate that risk overall. And I think that those opportunities also provide signal on how we can shift the model to prevent that as well. I think you do bring up a good point about the user feedback. It sometimes can feel like you're going into a black hole, but you're not getting maybe all the information back. And that's something I think the industry can hear, needs to hear as well.
Yep. Question.
Hey, good morning. Matt Noyes with the Secret Service. First, thanks to the organizers and the panelists. You mentioned the global signal exchange, which was pretty exciting. So this question's mostly to Nick and Abigail. Most of the most damaging scams involve some internet website or other internet assigned name to numbers. So I'm curious your thoughts of where you're thinking, where industry peers are thinking about how to shift the incentives in the internet ecosystem to really incentivize policing those internet assigned name to numbers? So is that, downranking tied to a particular high abuse domain registrar, autonomous system number, blocking communications related to that, not selling ads or hosting or providing email services? What steps to really shift those incentives to clean up the internet ecosystem to make this harder for scammers?
I think Google takes seriously like what is presented on search and those algorithms overall on how it's presented. And I think those things you're weighing are certainly, factors that are a part of that. I think the opportunity we have with the Global Signals Exchange is to figure out how do we properly get the information to the right parts of the ecosystem when it's needed to help take those next steps. And that's where I think the bet on the Global Signals Exchange can help do that. I think also for us too, this is another instance where AI is helpful, right? Where we use AI to help understand the sites that are using Google Ads as a platform and are able to more quickly demonetize them and understand them to prevent them from monetizing from our consumers. So I see all of those components as a part of the ecosystem.
I just plus one that I think it's I would say so the Global Signal Exchange is a piece, and the domain and the internet sort of hygiene that you're referencing is super important. What I'm cautious of just across the board of like somehow positioning some of those activities and efforts as sort of like the silver bullet on anything. And so like, yes, let's do it. Let's go there. Like, let's apply some of the rigor that's required on that front. The concern I have is because I think about the nature of bad actors and what's going to stop them from going somewhere else. And so sure, you clean up domains, but like then you're looking at phone numbers and then you're looking at, whatever. And so like, and it's not to dissuade us from doing it. We should absolutely do it. We are going to help people from doing these things, but we need to do other things as well.
Other questions? We're going to wait. If we have a few minutes.
Hi, Tarleton Watkins. I'm a policy advisor at the U.S. Treasury Department, and I work on fraud and illicit finance issues. I was similarly interested in the Global Signals Exchange and also on the discussion around information sharing. I understand, I think that both Google and Amazon are registered as money services businesses for some of their payments products. And so I'm wondering if either company has thought about information sharing under the auspices of Section 314B of the U.S. Patriot Act, and also the related AML-CFT compliance obligations under the Bank Secrecy Act, and what avenues for information sharing might be available to you there. Thanks.
I feel like that is a really smart question that I don't have an answer to as somebody who is not steeped in those particular laws. But we can find each other afterwards, and I'm happy to get you contacted with the folks who live and breathe those things.
Same.
No, you should answer that one. That's going to be really fun.
Hello, my name is Tamara Ward. I am a AI for Business graduate student at the University of Baltimore. This question is more so for Mike, but anyone can chime in. I recently wrote a paper on the patchwork of legislation, and I was curious to know, is there, and I also covered the moratorium on AI legislation at the state level. Is there any efforts underway for federal policymakers and state lawmakers sort of to work together to align some of the state legislation so that, one, businesses are not adversely impacted by the patchwork of legislation? Because I do understand that businesses that are working across multiple jurisdictions are facing a lot of regulatory and compliance complexities. But is there a way that they can come together at the state and federal level in the absence of unified legislation at the federal level, come together to sort of align the policies so that one, they don't stifle innovation, and two, states do have a say in a path forward?
Thanks. That's a really great question. And I'll admit, I focus myself really at the federal level. So I think sort of some of the questions around how state lawmakers or policymakers may be engaging with federal folks, I would need to rely a little bit on our state team at CTIA, and certainly happy to connect with you after and follow up. I think it's a really interesting idea, though, to figure out, absent federal legislation, what avenues may exist for that kind of information exchange between the federal and state levels. I personally don't have a great sense for that, but would be happy to try to find some more information.
All right. Joy, I'm sorry, we cannot take so many questions. There's a break, and of course you have the opportunity to ask those questions. So join me for a round of applause for these incredible panelists. Thank you.